Welcome to the Heavy Spoilers Show. I'm your host Paul, and this video we're breaking down the classic sci-fi horror Event Horizon. Callisto Protocol and the Dead Space remake has got me feeling for some survival horror in space, so I thought I'd revisit the movie that inspired both games. Though the film was a critical and commercial flop at the time, it's gained a massive following, and I think that's because it's something that's burned into the brains of every kid who watched it when they were younger. Back in 1997, this was my first real experience of something that pushed the limits of body horror this much. I think it had the same effect on a lot of kids growing up. We're all older now, and I think this movie's probably gained a cult following due to it scaring us as kids in a way that left a lifelong impression. Director Paul W.S. Anderson ended up working with Kurt Russell on the movie Soldier immediately after this, and naturally he felt down about the film underperforming. However, Russell said, "Forget about what this movie's doing now. In 15 years' time, this is going to be the movie you're glad you made." And I'm glad he made it too, as throughout this video we're going to be going through all the creepy details and things hidden within it that really elevate the film, and hopefully this helps you appreciate it even more than you already do. When researching films like this, I try to track down the origins for them and see what laid the seeds for the ideas we see on screen. Screenwriter Philip Eisner appeared on the Overhated Movies podcast, and he said that he came up with the idea for the film when he was watching The Shining. The Stanley Kubrick classic is one of my favourite movies of all time, and in case you haven't seen it, it centres around a family put in charge of looking after a haunted hotel for the winter. Due to poor weather conditions, there's no escape, and Eisner said that he very much wanted to do a haunted house movie in space. The Event Horizon was something you couldn't run out of and leave, and you were trapped on there, plagued with visions of hell and completely at its mercy. Another thing Eisner talked about was how space is very much hell as well. Humans can't survive in it, and if you ever find yourself stuck in space, then you're doomed to have an agonizing death as your lungs implode and the moisture in your body freezes. These were the building blocks for the movie, but it's also clear that the writer took inspiration from real-life ghost ships. The Mary Celeste is probably the most famous of these, and it was discovered adrift in the ocean with its crew completely missing. There was no sign of a struggle, and similar to the Event Horizon, it posed an eerie question for centuries over what really happened on it. Now we start off with the Paramount logo before transitioning into space. Absolutely love the way the movie does this, and it takes something calm and peaceful looking and instantly gives a feeling of danger. Now, there were hopes that we'd get a director's cut of the movie with extra footage, but unfortunately when they went to salvage this, they found Paramount hadn't been looking after it. We'll talk about what was in those deleted scenes later on, but for better or worse, this is the only cut we'll ever get. Now from here we get what appears to be a black hole that then transforms into an eye. As we go further into this, lines begin to appear, and it starts to transform into a tunnel leading towards the dark center. This is very important iconography, and it's something that repeats throughout the entire film. The gravity drive on the Event Horizon is a black hole that too appears like an eye. Around it are rings, and in order to get there, one has to travel through a bridge which sort of acts like a tunnel. When crafting the design of the ship, the creative team took a lot of inspiration from the cathedral in Notre Dame, and it was built to have this gothic look to it, conjuring up demonic imagery. In order to get to the drive itself, the passengers also have to travel through a smaller tunnel lined with razor-sharp spinning rings. This was done to resemble the 9 circles of hell from Dante's Inferno, and in order to get to the center, one has to pass through this. Now that work contains black holes which inspired the film, and it also has Latin inscriptions above gateways which say, "Abandon hope all ye who enter." Later on they receive a horrifying message in Latin, and this ends up saying, now this is thought to translate to "save me", however it's misheard, with its use here actually meaning "save yourself". Now as we mentioned earlier, the drive being like an eye is also very important. It gives the impression that something is constantly watching, and it very much reflects the saying that when one stares into the abyss stares back. This is very much a black hole at the center of a ship that has the ability to also create black holes. Eyes are something that are constantly brought up throughout the film, and at the end Dr. Weir says, "Where we're going, we won't need eyes to see." Now, an Event Horizon in scientific terms is something that's central to a black hole, and it's linked to the escape velocity that you'd need to escape one. Black holes have a gravity pull that means it's almost impossible to leave, and light itself can't even get out of one. This is why black holes look black, as they're completely absent of light, and as we need light to see, the characters wouldn't need eyes when they go into one. Now from here we get a rundown of man's achievements since 1997. What's that say? 2015? First permanent colony on the moon. Alright, Marty McFly. 2032 apparently had mining on Mars, and in 2040 the Event Horizon was launched. Now, obviously, for some reason in the 80s and 90s, we had a much more optimistic view of what humanity would be able to achieve in the next 40 years. Back to the Future was of course one, and don't even get me started on Blade Runner thinking what 2019 would be like. Obviously the creators thought things would go better than they did, and this is actually reflected in the uniforms that the crew wear as well. When creating them, Sam Neill actually requested that the Union Jack on his Australian flag should be replaced by an Aboriginal one to show that they gained independence from the British, but we'll never let you have it. Now, the US flag also has 55 stars in it, and the one for the EU has 22. Obviously, it's not 2047 yet, but hey, fingers crossed, we can all come together. Anyway, we then get some text that discusses the Event Horizon itself. Known as the worst space disaster on record, the ship was created to explore the boundaries of our solar system. It disappeared without a trace by Neptune, and we discover that it's been sighted once more above the planet, having returned from where it came from. The public were told a lie, and the official story said that the reactor went critical, which is when it self-destructed. This was to cover up the fact that they were attempting to create faster-than-light travel, which would break the laws of relativity and also the laws of physics. In the movie, we discover that the wormhole the drive opened actually created a gateway to hell itself, and doorways like this have appeared throughout myths and legends. Concocted during medieval times, it was believed that doorways to hell could be opened up, and that Satan and the souls of the damned would transport them to hell. Ouija boards are thought to be able to lower the barrier, and even in films like Rosemary's Baby, we get the notion that a gateway can be created. Medieval imagery is laced throughout the movie, and though we can't show it because of YouTube's strict demonetization policies, a lot of the torture devices are based on those created in the Middle Ages. Notre Dame itself was completed in the 1300s, and we of course hear Latin throughout the film when the passengers return from hell. This was all done to tie our own Dark Ages into futuristic space travel, and I love the way they've melded the past and future. The idea of eyes is hammered home when we first catch the ship, and behind it we can see the Eye of Neptune, which acts almost like it's watching it. As mentioned earlier, Event Horizon would go on to inspire games like Dead Space, and watching it drift past the camera gave me a lot of feelings of the Ishimura. We then cut at the ship itself and can once more see the large rings that line the walkway, and also pass a watch which is the Omega Speedmaster. Now, this is actually the wristwatch that was worn on the first American spacewalk, which I think is a nice cool little Easter egg. Now from here we catch Dr. Weir floating, and this is done in front of a cross symbol to evoke crucifixion imagery. It turns out that this is a dream that he's having, and this actually plays in the ending of the film. Though some people manage to survive, Stark has a vision where she thinks the rescue crew is headed up by none other than Dr. Weir. This being put in place to mirror the opening lends to the possibility that they might not have escaped the ship at all, and it may be pulling them back just like how it did with Dr. Weir. I don't think that's the case, but I thought I'd bring it up just in case, and we will discuss it more as we hit the end of the video. Now, Weir's a tortured character, and we learn that he's haunted by the guilt he feels over his wife taking her life. Guilt is something that's prevalent throughout the film, and the three characters that are harmed by the ship directly all suffer from this. On top of Weir, Peters is the character that ends up taken by the ship, and she carries the guilt of her broken marriage and also the fact she left her son on Earth. We discover that Miller tried to have her replaced so that she could stay and look after her sick son, but unfortunately the transfer didn't go through in time. Her death could be something that he later feels responsible for, and it's clear that she feels like she abandoned her ill child. She's tormented with visions of him, and the spectre very much represents the guilt that she's carrying. And lastly is Captain Miller, played by none other than Lawrence Fishburne. We discover that he abandoned a past crew member and that they ended up burning to death in space, which was completely agonizing. He still feels guilt over this, and his sacrifice at the end is him very much atoning for that loss by staying behind like his shipmate. Now, it's possible that Stark may carry guilt over this and feel like she abandoned him, which is why she gets the vision. It's important to bear in mind that each person killed by the ship had something to atone for, and this may be why we see Weir at the end. Anyway, Weir walks about his room, and we see a shrine of photos dedicated to his wife. Weirdly, there's two of the same ones here, and that's what you get for having photos, mate. Didn't they have iPhones in 2047? Didn't predict that, did you open and crawl, you f***ing. Now he looks at a bathtub, which we discover she drowned in, and later on he'll be bathed in water surrounded by the opposite to it in fire. This very much represents the fire of hell, and water and fire are of course opposites. Weir then opens his blinds, and we hear this sound. Now this was actually taken from the video game Doom, which is of course also closely linked to hell. Now from here we get an incredible one-take shot of Daylight Station. Initially we start off with an upside down view of Weir before we pull out and get a rotating shot of the entire station before we see it in all its glory above Earth. Now what you probably don't know is that this 45-second shot actually cost a third of the film's budget. Anyway, he reports to the Lewis and Clark, which is where we meet the rest of the characters. This shot also does something similar to the prior one, but instead we zoom in on the ship. VFX artist Sue Rowe said it was the most difficult shot she'd ever worked on, and it involved lining up different model shots and passes with footage using real actors. Now the name Lewis and Clark was chosen for a specific reason, and it's meant to mirror the Event Horizon. Lewis and Clark carried out an expedition across America and they mapped out most of the West during the 1800s. The Event Horizon is of course setting off on its own expedition into uncharted territory, and it's sort of like poetry, they rhyme. Now this is very much a search and rescue mission, and you can actually see the red US Coast Guard racing stripe painted on the hull. The crew also have a shield on their lapels, which too is a symbol that the Coast Guard use. As mentioned earlier, the Event Horizon is based on ghost ships, so this Coast Guard inclusion is really smart. Alongside Justin, we also meet Smith, played by Sean Pertwee. Carrying on the religious imagery, he also draws a sign of a cross on his chest before the crew get up and leave. Now at this point, we get some subtle coffin imagery as Miller walks through one of the doorways. You may notice that the opening is shaped like a coffin, and this is something that repeats throughout the film at several points. The suspended animation tubes also give the idea of death, with us catching Cooper floating in one, which, I don't know, just looks very strange. Now you can also catch an ink tattoo on Smith's back, which is supposed to represent life. We then see as the moon passes in front of Neptune, again creating this eye imagery before we cut to Weir. Weir ends up having a nightmare that he wakes up on the ship and finds his wife with her eyes missing. Now before he spins the chair around, we actually get a reflection of her face in a screen, and if you look along the top you can catch a pair of eyes. I almost pooped my pants when I first noticed these, and it gives the feeling that you're constantly being watched. Now his wife very much inspired Nicole in Dead Space, and just in the same way that she appeared in Visions, his wife also does too. Dead Space even somewhat took the ending of this movie, with us getting a jump scare from Nicole, whereas here it is of course Weir. Now from here we cut to a video of Denny's birthday party, and look at that clown mate, f*** me. Try telling me this isn't a horror movie. Now they sit around a table chatting away, and this is clearly riffing on the dinner scene that happens in Alien. We can see that Smith also wears a crucifix, and we meet Cooper and DJ. Is that Lucius Malfoy? Anyway, Weir explains how wormholes work, and he does this by using a piece of paper. This is something that's been used in several other films, including Interstellar, and more recently in Thor: Love and Thunder. Now we discover that they were attempting to reach Proxima Centauri, which in reality is one of the closest stars to our sun. This has its own system of planets that could potentially one day allow us to inhabit it, again tying into this idea of it all being an expedition. Now they discover the ship after a little bit of trouble, and we see the little toy bear fall off one of the computers. I'm reaching, but Justin goes by the nickname Baby Bear, and Peters goes by the nickname Mama Bear, and they both fall, so foreshadowing. Anyway, they look at the ship through a periscope, and this contains text from the compartmental destruction of radio tracers, as well as the IBM 7094. They come across the docking bay, and we can see Roman numerals on it. These give the number 13, which is of course thought to be unlucky. Now the team suit up and head out, and if you checked out our breakdown of Arrival, then you'll know we talked about how the hazmat suits on the ship were CGI. This was to help the actors act like they were in space, but in 1997, they didn't have that kind of technology. Everything had to be done practically, and the suits were extremely heavy. This got to the point that in between takes, the crew had to be suspended on poles to take the weight off their back. 80skids.com shouted that when Eisner visited the set, Lawrence Fishburne shouted, "You're Eisner, you did this to me," and the writer quickly left. Now we also see the suits clamped down with magnetic boots, and again, this heavily inspired Isaac Clarke's suit in Dead Space. Justin makes his way into the core, and I don't know if I'd be walking into a room with spikes on the doors like that, but moving on. Now Peter discovers a corpse with its eyes out and cuts across his face. And this is something that Weir later ends up doing, showing how the ship needs a member of the crew that it can use to carry out its will. The gravity drive activates, and it pulls Justin while sending out a shockwave. This causes the Lewis and Clark to overload, and thus the crew have to go onto the event horizon. Slowly, they piece together what happened on it, and we see Weir explaining how the gravity drive works. He stares at it and focuses on the circles, with them seeming almost like eyes that are then reflected in his own. Peters then discovers the final log, which plays out what happened when they opened the gravity drive. This unleashed hell, and the footage we get here, you know what I'm going to say, can't show it on YouTube. It's on Reddit though, and if you click the more comments on the pinned one, I'll leave you a link where you can go see the images and then come back. If not, I was thinking about recreating it, but we'll try and keep things PG-13. Everything's on screen for a split second, and it's a montage of messed up moments that have some of the sickest body horror I've ever seen. There's also the captain who holds up a pair of eyes in his hands, tying into the fact that they don't need them to see in hell. Weir then crawls into the maintenance tunnels, and we get a similar scene to Alien. These cramped conditions create claustrophobia, and eventually he's grabbed by a vision of his wife. Miller sees the crew member he left behind, and this ends up foreshadowing why Weir takes on this form at the end of the movie. Stark concurs that the ship is indeed alive now, and Eisner said he took inspiration from the haunting by making the location just as unnerving as the events we see playing out. After lying comatose with his eyes open, Justin then gets up and he goes out to the airlock. The scene is so tense as we have a countdown going on, knowing that he's about to be thrown into space. We also have a locked room that Stark's trying to get open, and Miller racing towards him in order to save his life. Each one of these is against the clock, with them desperate to stop what we know is about to happen. Miller manages to save him, but it's clear that the guy has gone through hell. After hearing the voice of his doomed crew member, Miller sits down with DJ and he tells him about what happened. I love this shot of the two corridors with them, and it almost creates a feeling of a face. The way the corridor wraps around them makes it seem like eyes silently watching them in the background as the story plays out. Miller says that fire in space washes over someone like water, and this further ties the two elements together like what we talked about earlier. On the outer hull, Smith and Cooper fix up the ship, which is when Weir begs them to stay. He disappears into the shadows after saying the ship won't let them leave, which is of course when it all goes down. In a similar scene to Alien, we watch two crew members taking supplies and trying to flee the ship. However, it powers up and it tricks Peters into returning after she sees a vision of her son. We get the gravity drive reflected in her eyes, and as she runs through the tunnels, we can also see this looks like an eye itself. The light in the background acts as a pupil, and the tunnel itself ends up being the iris. Now she climbs up a ladder, and as she goes up it, we see doorways shaped like coffins all around her. Her son also stands in a coffin-shaped doorway, and this leads to her falling to her death. This idea of guilt is also mirrored in Weir, who has a vision of his wife's death before she pushes his eyes out. This allows him to see the truth, and he starts to kill the other crew members. On board the Lewis and Clark, he places one of the explosives, and Smith discovers this just before it detonates. Now Smith could have actually stopped this, as he had 6 seconds left, and we see a big disarm button. Big disarm button right there, mate. Just need to press that. I love how Cooper actually survives this, and with his boots he stays attached to the hull, and then blasts himself back to the ship by purging out his air tank. Again, Dead Space 2 did something similar to this when you finished realigning the solar panels and had to get yourself back to Titan Station as quickly as you could. Now DJ is cut open and left with his guts hanging out, and the creative team said that this was a reference to the Silence of the Lambs novel, which was later brought into Hannibal. Miller finds Stark on the bridge, and we can see that Weir now sits in the captain's chair. He ends up activating the gravity drive, and this then gives them 10 minutes to get off the ship. Cooper makes it back, and he distracts Weir so that Miller can escape, and after the window's blown out, he watches everything get sucked into space. Again, Dead Space 2, they had rooms like this, and it's such a cool effect watching everything get pulled out. Weir is taken out too, and it very much riffs on the dream that he had at the start of the movie. Cooper makes it back on board the ship, and they then plan to blow it. Miller says,
"Look, TDRS will pick up our emergency beacon."
Now TDRS stands for Tracking and Data Relay Satellite, which would be the first thing that would make contact with them. The ship walls then start to bleed, with blood running along the lights and filling up the main chamber. This comes crashing out, and this is clearly reference to the elevator scene in The Shining. Miller is knocked in the gravity drive by what appears to be his friend, but as we've discussed before, this is really Weir. He detonates the explosives by trapping himself in with Weir, and this ending is something that's always stuck with me. The guy has just damned himself to suffer in hell for eternity, and he gets sucked into the planet after Weir constantly says, "Do you see? Do you see?" This is possibly also reference to Red Dragon, which ties in with the Silence of the Lamb book before. The lifeboat manages to make it out, and we watch as the Event Horizons pulled into the planet to a fate unknown. We close out with the crew being rescued, but with this part of the ship still remaining, we don't know if the nightmare is truly over. It depends if you see the ship as being alive or not, and whether it's linked to the gravity drive or the lifeboat is detached. We are promised that the crew were all coming with him, and this vision could be a final scare, or it may hint to something sinister going on. I'll leave that up to you to decide, and as for the deleted scenes, these were cut from the film because test audiences didn't like them, and it completely spooked Paramount. As we mentioned, they didn't take care of them, and unfortunately the film has been lost to time. The gore was turned up to 11, with a compilation being extended to show a woman with her mouth being held open by clamps and a man drilling into her teeth. They pop up on screen for a split second. Again, we can't show it, but there are bits where Stock's being crucified on a metal bench with barbed wire wrapped around her head almost like a crown, maggots across people's chest, and let's just say a bit of romance going on. Brief glimpses of these moments specifically are shown in the film, but in the deleted scenes they got much more focus. Now we also had a nod to The Exorcist, in which Regan walked backwards down the stairs like a spider. Instead of Regan though, Weir would do this completely nude after the shining blood scene. The crew would then discuss their fears, with DJ explaining that the scars on his body were from childhood operations. Peters would also see her son's legs covered in maggots, and all in all, the horror scenes were slightly more intense. Anyway, that wraps up the movie, and also our breakdown. I had a blast going through this, and I hope you saw something that you hadn't noticed before. If you enjoyed it, please drop a thumbs up, and make sure you subscribe for videos like this every day. If you want to watch our breakdown of Arrival, that will be linked on screen right now, and hopefully you've been enjoying these trips through older movies. The next film I want to tackle is The Shining, so keep an eye out for that. Out of the way, thanks for clicking the video. Hope you enjoy the rest of your week. I've been Paul, you've been the best. Don't have nightmares. Take care. Peace.